The Snow Queen. Once upon a time there was a wicked pixie. He was the most mischievous of all pixies. On a day when he felt particularly crafty, he made a mirror with the power of causing all that was good and beautiful to look cruel and ugly when reflected in the mirror. Anything cruel and nasty would be reflected back as sweet and lovely. In this mirror, the most beautiful landscapes looked like boiled spinach, and the kindest people were turned into ghastly kinds.
"That's glorious fun,"
said the pixie. He ran all over the village with his horrible mirror, and not long after everyone knew of this ghastly mirror, sure that it was the true reflector of the world and its people, did their interests grow. Soon the pixies began to argue about who would be allowed to carry the mirror next, and as they grabbed and pulled and pushed each other, they flew higher and higher up into the sky. Their fighting soon caused the mirror to slip from their hands and plummet to the earth, where it shattered into millions of tiny shards of glass. Some of these pieces were hardly as large as a grain of sand, and they flew about in the wide world, and when they got into people's eyes, there they stayed. Those poor people saw everything backwards. Whatever was good now looked bad to them, and whatever was kind was cruel to them. Tainted by the glass shards in their eyes, they began to long for the bad things in life, thinking that it was good, and shunning goodness, thinking it was bad. Some strangers even got a splinter in their heart, which was the saddest of all, because their hearts became like lumps of ice. Other broken pieces of the wretched mirror were so large that they were used for window panes, through which one could no longer see their friends. Other pieces were put in spectacles, and that too was sad, because when people put on their glasses to see better, they saw only the distortions of life. And so these warped perceptions continued through the years. In a large town where there are so many houses and people that they all lived in apartments tightly stacked together without even room for a large garden, there lived 2 little children. They were not brother and sister, but they cared for each other as if they were. They were best friends who lived only just across from one another, with a tiny patch of grass separating their 2 apartments. On the tiny patch of grass were 2 boxes in which were planted 2 rose bushes that grew very well despite the snug area. After many months of care, the rose bushes grew into each other, creating a beautiful space for the children to sit and chat to each other without having to leave their home space. In winter, however, there was an end of this joyfulness. The heavy snow forced them to keep the doors and windows that led to opposite apartments tightly shut, using only the doors on the outside to leave the apartments if needed. This meant that the little boy and girl couldn't sit outside enjoying each other's company until it warmed again. The little boy, Kai, and the little girl, Greta, hated the winters, seeing each other only at school. One day Kai sat staring out the frosted window.
"The frost is thick today,"
said his grandmother.
"Yes, it is. I do wish it would end quickly. The Snow Queen would not have that,"
replied the grandmother, knowing exactly why Kai longed for summer.
"If I got my hands on her, I'd set her in a pot on the stove and melt her iceberg of a heart."
Kai's grandmother chuckled and patted his head, then began telling him other stories, trying to distract him from his loneliness. The next day there was a sharp frost, and then came the spring. The sun shone, the green leaves appeared, the swallows built their nests, the windows were opened, and the little children again sat in their pretty garden. That summer the roses flowered in untamed beauty. Greta had learned a song in which there was something about roses, and sang it as she laughed and played with Kai.
I love springtime with the glorious sunshine. We play in the breezes that lift the rosebud's head. The beautiful fragrances dance on my nose. How happy to be with a friend that I love.
What lovely summer days those were! How delightful to be out in the air near the fresh rose bushes that seemed as if they would never stop blooming. Kai and Greta looked through the picture book together as they sat in the summer breeze. Kai suddenly grabbed his eye and said,
"Oh, I think something has flown into my eye."
The breeze picked up, and he clutched his chest and shivered, still rubbing his eye. The little girl put her arms around his neck, trying to ease his pain. He blinked his eyes, and Greta looked at him, but could see nothing caught in his eye.
I think it's out now,"
he said, drying the tears that had fallen. But it was not out. Something was still caught in his eye that neither of the children could see and that Kai could no longer feel. A tiny piece of the pixie's mirror had flown into Kai's eye, and as the breeze picked up, another had struck into his heart. Poor Kai and Greta had no idea what had happened, and continued chatting for a bit, unaware of the glass shards that was stuck forever in his eye and heart, and would soon turn to ice.
"What are you crying for?"
asked Kai, seeing that Greta was so very tearful.
"You look so ugly. There's nothing the matter with me,"
he continued. He turned to look at the rose bushes.
"Oh,"
he said at once.
"that rose is crooked. And look, this one is bent. Looking at them now, these roses are very ugly. They are just like the box they're planted in."
And then he gave the box a good kick with his foot and pulled both the roses up.
What are you doing?
cried Greta, and as Kai saw her fright, he pulled up another rose, jumped up, and ran away from Greta. She cried as she looked at the broken rose plants and tried her best to put them back into the box. The next day, she brought her picture book back to where they would sit and chat. Kai sat next to her, looking awfully glum, and asked,
"What horrible book have you there?"
Greta was confused. Kai had always enjoyed their picture book and wondered why Kai was now so mean-spirited about it. His strange behavior continued. When Kai's grandmother told him stories, he always interrupted her or laughed at how silly the stories were. Kai would walk along the street making fun of everyone, the things they said, the clothes they wore, and even teased the way they looked. What hurt the most was when he came home and sat with Greta in the tiny garden and teased her or made fun of her habits. It crushed her to her soul, because she could not understand why Kai would ever want to hurt her in such a way. No one could figure out why, because they could not see the glass shards in his eye and in his heart that caused him to see the kindness of others turned to ugliness by these shards. His games now were quite different to what they had been. He seemed to want to spend less and less time with Greta, and she became lonelier and lonelier. Soon it was winter again.
Do you want to read together today, Kai?
asked Greta, seeing Kai at school.
"I'm allowed to go into the square where the others are playing. I don't have any interest in reading your silly book."
And off he was in a moment. There in the marketplace, some of the bravest boys used to tie their sleds to the carts as they passed by, and so they were pulled along and got a good ride. It was such good fun. A large sled passed by. It was painted white, and there was someone in it wrapped up in a rough white mantle of fur. The sled drove around the square twice, and Kai tied his sled as quickly as he could, and off he drove with it. On they went, quicker and quicker into the next street, and the person who drove turned round to Kai and nodded to him in a friendly manner, just as if they knew each other. Every time he was going to untie his sled, the person nodded to him, and then Kai sat quiet. And so on they went till they came outside the gates of the town. He then cried out as loud as he could, but no one heard him. The snow drifted, and the sled flew on. The snowflakes grew larger and larger, till at last they looked just like white birds. Suddenly the large sled stopped, and the person who drove stood up. It was a lady. Her cloak and cap were of snow. She was tall and of a slender figure, and of a dazzling whiteness. It was the Snow Queen.
"We have travelled fast," she said, "but it is freezing cold. Come under my coat."
And she put him in the sled beside her, wrapped the fur around him. After a few moments, Kai began to feel warmer despite the cold.
"Are you still cold?"
she asked. He was. It was colder than ice. It sank to his very heart, which was almost a frozen lump. It seemed to him as if he were about to die, and yet he shook his head no, as if the cold was comfortable to him. The Snow Queen got out of the sled with Kai, still wrapped in her coat, and they began to walk away.
"My sled! Don't forget my sled!"
shouted Kai. The Snow Queen wrapped him tighter in, and he began to forget the sled, the ride, Greta, and his grandmother with every step that they took together. He walked on with the Snow Queen. She held him tighter and tighter until he stopped and looked back and grew colder and emptier.
"Now you will have no more hugs,"
she said,
"or else I will hug you to death."
Kai looked at her. She was very beautiful, more beautiful and kind than anyone he had ever seen. She no longer appeared of ice as before, and Kai was not afraid in the least. The Queen took to the sky and flew with him, flew high over the black clouds. While the storm moaned and whistled, on they went. Kai looked at the Snow Queen, having no memory of anything before she had come to him. Greta looked out of her window into the destroyed rose bushes. Kai had broken the branches too much for them to be saved when she had replanted them, so she had left them lifeless in the box, too sad to throw them out. What had happened to Kai? Where could he be? Nobody knew. Nobody could give any information. All the boys knew was that they had seen him tie his sled to another large and splendid one, which drove down the street and out of the town. Nobody knew where he was, and many sad tears were shed, and little Greta wept long and bitterly until at last she said he must be dead, that he had got lost in the storm. Yet still she hoped to see him, hoped she had been wrong. It was the longest and saddest winter she had ever lived. At last spring came, with its warm sunshine.
Kai is no longer,
said little Greta.
"I do not believe that,"
said the sunshine.
Kai is gone.
She said to the swallows.
Kai is no more.
She told the raindrops.
"That is not true,"
said the drops.
Kai is gone,
she said to the summer breeze.
"That I don't believe,"
they said, and at last Greta did not think so any longer either.
I'll put on my red shoes,
she said one morning.
Kai has never seen them, and then I'll go down to the river and ask there.
It was quite early. She kissed her old grandmother, who was still asleep, put on her red shoes, and went alone to the river.
Have you taken my friend? I will give you my red shoes, if you will give him back to me.
And as it seemed to her, the blue waves nodded in a strange manner. Then she took off her red shoes, the most precious things she possessed, and threw them into the river. But they fell close to the bank, and the little waves washed them immediately to land. It was as if the stream would not take what was dearest to her, for in reality it had not taken little Kai. But Greta thought that she had not thrown the shoes out far enough, so she clambered into a boat which lay among the rushes, went to the farthest end, and threw out the shoes. The boat jostled in the waves and drifted from the shore. She tried to get back, but before she could do so, the boat glided quickly onward. Little Greta was very frightened and began to cry, but no one heard her except the sparrows, and they could not carry her to land, but they flew along the bank and sang out as if to comfort her. The boat drifted with the stream. Little Greta sat quite still without her shoes. They were swimming behind the boat, but she could not reach them because the boat went on much faster than they did. The banks on both sides were beautiful. Lovely flowers and beautiful trees, and slopes with sheep and cows, but not a human was to be seen.
Perhaps the river will carry me to little Kai,
she said, and then she grew less sad. She stood and looked for many hours at the beautiful green banks. She sailed by a large cherry orchard. There was a little cottage. Greta called out, hoping that whomever lived there would hear her cries.
Hello?
Greta called louder,
Hello?
and an old woman then came out of the cottage, leaning on a crooked stick.
"Oh, you poor little child,"
said the old woman.
"how did you get on the river?"
The old woman went into the water, caught hold of the boat with her crooked stick, drew it to the bank, and lifted little Greta out. Greta was so glad to be on dry land again, but she was rather afraid of the old, strange woman.
"Come and tell me who you are and how you came here,"
she said. Greta told her everything, and the old woman shook her head. Greta asked if she had seen little Kai, and the woman answered that he had not passed there, but no doubt would. She told her not to be sad. She then took Greta by the hand, led her into the little cottage, and locked the door. The windows were very high up. The glass was red, blue, and green, and the sunlight shone through quite wondrously in all sorts of colors. On the table stood the most exquisite cherries, and Greta ate as many as she chose. While she was eating, the old woman combed her hair with a brush, and her hair curled and shone.
"I have often longed for such a little dear granddaughter,"
said the old woman.
"Now you shall see how well we get along together."
And while she combed Greta's hair, the child forgot her friend Kai more and more. The old woman understood magic, but she was not evil. She just wanted Greta to stay with her. The old woman went out in the garden, stretched out her crooked stick towards the rose bushes, making them sink into the earth. The old woman feared that if Greta saw the roses, she would then think of her own, would remember Kai, and run away from her. She led Greta into the flower garden. Oh, what fragrance and what loveliness was there! Every flower that one could think of, and of every season, stood there in fullest bloom. No picture book could be so beautiful. Greta jumped for joy, played till the sun set behind the tall cherry tree. She was given a pretty bed with a red silken coverlet filled with blue violets. She fell asleep and had pleasant dreams. The next morning she went to play with the flowers in the warm sunshine. She danced with the butterflies and chatted to the squirrels. Greta knew every flower, and numerous as they were, it still seemed to Greta that something was missing, though she did not know what. One day, while she was looking at the hat of the old woman, she saw a rose. The old woman had forgotten to take it from her hat when she had made the others vanish in the earth.
What?
Said Greta.
Are there no roses here?
And she ran about amongst the flower beds and looked, and there was not one to be found. She then sat down and wept, but her hot tears fell just where the rosebush had sunk, and when her warm tears watered the garden, the tree shot up suddenly, as fresh and blooming as when it had been swallowed up. Greta touched the roses, thought of her own dear roses at home, and with them of little Kai.
Oh, I've stayed here so long,
said the little girl.
I was supposed to be looking for Kai. Don't you know where he is? Do you think he is gone forever?
She asked the roses.
Dead he certainly is not,
said the roses.
We have been in the earth, where all the dead are, but Kai was not there.
Thank you,
said little Greta, and she went to the other flowers, looked into their cups, and asked,
Don't you know where little Kai is?
But every flower stood enjoying the sunshine, and they all told her very many things, but not one knew of Kai. If she wanted to find Kai, she was convinced that she would have to do so on her own. Greta ran to the gate at the bottom of the garden. The gate was locked, but she shook the rusted bolt till it was loosened, and the gate opened. Hearing the lock creak, the old woman came hobbling down the garden.
Where are you going, sweet child?
Kai! Oh, Kai! I was meant to find him, but I have stayed here so long that I have forgotten my friend. How can I be so terrible?
Greta clung to the old woman and cried as guilt washed over her.
Oh, sweet little Greta,
said the old woman.
Do forgive me.
Greta looked confused.
Forgive you? But why? You have been so kind and good. You are a dear old woman, and have made me so comfortable. What do I have to forgive you for?
The old woman sat down on a large rock and explained that it was her magic hairbrush that removed the thoughts of Kai from Greta's mind. She said that she was very lonely and wanted to take care of the little girl, just like she used to with her own granddaughter. When she had found Greta in the river, she thought the fairies had granted her wish and tried everything she could to keep Greta. She even got rid of the rose bushes in the hopes that Greta's memory would never be sparked.
Watching you weep as you do now, how could I ever have been so cruel?
Said the old woman, drained and ashamed. Greta looked at the woman and knew instantly that she was not hateful, but sought only the companionship that Greta herself sought, bringing her on this journey. She dried her tears and said,
Don't cry. You have been good to me, and every journey needs portions of rest, so I thank you for giving me that and taking care of me.
Thank you for sharing your time with me, and I do hope you find Kai soon. The magic that holds him is strong and cruel.
So you have seen Kai?
Greta asked.
I have. He passed here only a few weeks ago. I don't know who he was when I saw the young boy, and you then asked about him. I know he must be one and the same. He sat on the back of a large white sled that flew through the sky. But you must be very careful, my child. He rode alongside the Snow Queen. He was blue nearly to the core, but seemed not to notice the cold. I found it strange until my magic hat began to shudder.
The old woman explained how her hat could sense the magic around her, and that she had heard of the glass shards of a mirror created by pixies that had shattered and been blown into the eyes and hearts of people everywhere. She explained how difficult it would be for Kai to recognize and understand Greta, and that as soon as Greta had managed to rid Kai of the hateful glass in his eye and heart, he would be free. With that and a quick farewell, Greta thanked the old woman again and ran on into the woods. Filled with hope, she stopped only when her feet could go on no more, rested for a while, and on she trod. Weeks and weeks later, she finally stopped altogether and stood barefoot in the snow in Lapland. Filled with new hope that numbed her to the cold, Greta ran on as fast as she could. She slowed as she saw what looked like a storm of enormous snowflakes heading toward her. They were no ordinary snowflakes. They were soldiers of the Snow Queen. They looked like soldiers and moved like soldiers, but they were most certainly not human. The Queen seemed to have an entire army of snowflake soldiers. Growing more frightened as the number increased, Greta hid behind a tree, mumbling a prayer. She heard shouts and roars, but refused to look around the tree. If she were to die now, she would at least know that she had tried everything to save Kai and would at least die at peace. The screams got louder, and Greta closed her eyes, waiting the unthinkable, until there was silence. Curious and a little confused, Greta peered around the tree to find nothing of anything she had seen before. Not a single soldier in sight, not even a snowflake. Everything was still and clear. Not waiting an explanation, Greta quickly ran on toward the palace of the Snow Queen. The walls of the palace were made of misted ice, and the windows and doors the most delicate frost. There were more than 100 rooms, and Greta felt the enormity of the place from the moment she stepped into it. Everything glowed by the powerful light of Aurora Borealis, and everything around her was so large, so empty, so icy cold, and yet so resplendent. The halls were empty, but not just without the presence of people, but filled with the absence and emptiness of joy. Greta peered from behind a large pillar. In the middle of the emptiness was an endless hall of snow with a frozen lake. The lake was cracked in 1,000 pieces, but each piece was so like the other that it seemed the work of a cunning trap. In the middle of this lake sat the Snow Queen, and beside her a little boy so cold and blue. Greta recognized him immediately. It was Kai. She gasped at the sight. Little Kai was quite blue, yes, nearly black with cold. But he did not seem to realize it. The Snow Queen had hugged away all feeling of cold from his body, and his heart was a lump of ice. With a deep blank look on his face, Kai was dragging around pieces of ice and appeared to be building something, though Greta could not tell what. Suddenly the Snow Queen stood up.
"I am going now to warmer lands," she said. "I must have a look down into the black cauldrons."
It was the volcanoes Vesuvius and Etna that she mentioned.
"I will just give them a white coating, for that is as it ought to be, for it is now deep winter there."
With that, away she flew, and Kai sat quite alone in the empty halls of ice that were miles and miles long, and looked at the blocks of ice, numb and motionless. One would have imagined he was frozen to death. Greta stepped out from behind the pillar, yelled out for Kai,
Kai!
and flew to embrace him, her arms firmly holding him the while.
Kai! My sweet friend Kai! Have I then found you at last?
But he sat quite still, unmoving and cold. Greta cried tears that seemed fiery hot against her cold skin.
Kai! Oh,
she said, and placed her hands on his cheeks, forcing his eyes to her. But she saw nothing but deep pools of black.
Oh, Kai! Have you gone?
Greta cried bitterly and rested her head against his chest. She began to shiver, suddenly aware of the cold that surrounded her. From her feet to her face that lay against Kai's chest, she was defeated and cried and cried. Her eyes echoed through the empty halls, and after what seemed like many hours of lying against Kai, Greta felt something strange against her cheek that lay on his chest. Her hot tears had begun to melt Kai's icy heart, and she began to feel a gentle warmth against her face. She placed her hand on his chest and felt soft, slow heartbeats. Greta's tears had melted Kai's heart, made of ice, and so dissolved the splinter caught in it. She looked into his eyes, but the blankness stared back at her. She lay on his chest again and began to sing the song she used to when she and Kai would play at their rose bushes.
Oh, how I love springtime with the glorious sunshine. We play in the breezes that lift the rosebud's hair. The beautiful fragrances dance on my nose. How happy to be with a friend that I love.
His heart began to beat, growing stronger, until Greta felt his chest move. She looked up at him once more, and his eyes were filled with tears. Remembering what the old woman had told her, Greta went on singing until the tears flowed out of Kai's eyes and washed the horrid splinter right out. Kai sobbed, finally recognizing her, and shouted,
Greta! My friend Greta!
Kai! My sweet friend Kai!
Where have you been so long? And where have I been?
He looked round him.
How very cold it is here. How empty and cold,
he said, and he held fast to Greta, who laughed and wept for joy. They took each other by the hand and wandered out of the large hall. Greta couldn't help but begin telling Kai all about her journey. They talked of their old grandmothers and of the roses upon the roof. With the Snow Queen's curse broken, the storm ceased and the winds died down. The sun shone bright and warm on the happy pair. They reached the bush with the red berries that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and after a delightful feast, there appeared 2 reindeers. They then carried Kai and Greta to the boundary of the country. Kai and Greta thanked them and walked the rest of the way, and hearing church bells, which they recognized immediately as the bells from their own town, they began to run, eager to see their families again. Bursting into their apartments, the children hung onto their parents, and after some chatter and what had happened, the 2 looked out of the windows at the rose bushes that had grown despite their earlier destruction. Kai and Greta held hands and stood before their roses as they did before. They cried in joy and relief. Finally back home. Finally together again.